Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
I'm your co-host, Rich Gear, here with you, and tonight we're going to talk about Fossil Forensics by Jerry Bergman, correct?
That's his new book.
Yep.
Jerry seems to crank out a new book every 6 months.
He's incredible, I'll tell you. He really is.
But what's contained in these books that he's cranking out are the results of maybe 50 years of research that he's done, and he's been able to gather all this information from his extensive collection of books that he's
right, we've seen his library, and it's quite amazing. You know.
And the reason he calls it fossil forensics is to distinguish the science of forensics from empirical science. Now, empirical science is what you would do in a laboratory, where you would set up an experiment where you can control the conditions, and you can actually take and mix some chemicals or shine some light.
It's the classic definition of science, right? It's testable, it's repeatable, it's observable, it's falsifiable. Is there anything else? I think those are the main things, basically.
Basically,
it's
that's
empirical science. Okay, so forensic science, people are familiar with the term forensics. If you watch CSI and a lot of these things, they're going to know sort of where we're going on this. But for those who don't, why don't you give a definition of it, Doug?
Well, it's sort of where you have something that's happened in the past, and you can't actually go back in time to go back and repeat exactly what happened. And so you have to take the clues that are already there, such as fossils, for example, or if you have a whodunit, somebody gets
it's a crime
shot.
Scene investigation. You find out which way the blood splattered, or if there's this thing or that thing, and they try to piece things together. Or if you find a skull, Well, that's the same thing with the fossil record, right, Doug? They're trying to piece things back.
And so you can't really do an actual scientific empirical experiment to simulate unless you have what's called a model. And if you can set up a model of what might have happened and actually repeat the circumstances that could have caused this, then you'd be able to actually show with a reasonable amount of certainty what could have happened. Like, for example, if you find the bullet in the body that got shot, you can usually set up an experiment if you find a gun on the gun scene, on the scene of the crime. You want to find out if that was actually the gun that was used to shoot the person. Well, you go and shoot another bullet out of the same gun, and to see if the grooves on the bullet match
ballistics.
And so you have the ballistics that take place, and it shows how that could have been the murder weapon. And so then you can piece a little bit of the clues back together from what you find on the crime scene.
So this little caveat I would say to the audience here is that both creationists and evolutionists are in the same boat in this sense. We can't go back and repeat. We have several models for, let's say, the worldwide flood, which we believe happened. They would have models for millions of years of strata being laid down one layer at a time or whatever.
Same grain at a time.
So, and so there are different models that are proposed for how things happen. We would like to, I would say we'd like to differ in this respect. We believe we have a witness that told us how it was done, and that's where we come from there. And we think the witness is credible, and pretty much everything we see in the present seems to confirm that witness was credible, i.e. God, if you will. The book of Genesis is where we get a lot of stuff. But it's not merely a theological exercise any more than evolution is only a scientific exercise. They both entail some faith and some belief in things that we haven't seen and can't repeat and can't test. I was reading years ago that, like, for instance, granite. They cannot simulate how to make granite in the test. As far as I know,
rhyolite.
What's that?
If you try to create granite in the test tube, you get rhyolite instead of granite.
Is that right? I mean, it's like a fiat rock. We don't know how it was done. or we may have ideas of how it's done. We can't make it. Anyway, the point of it is that Jerry Bergman does some incredible stuff dealing with fossils specifically,
Right.
and that's one thing about forensics thing. There's no fossil, there's no T-Rex bone that says 65 million BC.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
they don't have anything like that. Sorry.
And we did a show years ago called "Rocks Are Not Clocks."
Right.
And so when you find a fossil or in a sedimentary rock, which you cannot date by radiometric means,
Sedimentary rock. Can't be
Sedimentary
dated,
rock.
right? Yeah.
you can only date igneous rock, and then you have certain assumptions that are set aside.
Which have been falsified in a lot of respects.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so that begs the question of what's right. It's only right if the dates give what they a priori decided they should be. We found that out a lot, and that's kind of really not science. That's really getting what you want. Okay, I mean they can. We don't get it too far afield. We weren't earlier talking about the fossils. The radiometric dating is a whole, we've done shows on that as well. Right. And it is interesting because people conflate the two things. They think a fossil in a sedimentary rock can be dated by carbon dating, which is useless for millions of years anyway. But if they're a little bit more wise and they use rubidium, strontium, or potassium argon, or uranium lead, or lead, or what any of those other ones, you still can't do it from the fossils. It just doesn't do that. So what Gary does, though, is for forensically, he starts out, he goes through all kinds of stuff. He goes from the simplest, quote, the simplest to the most complex, or the most, he goes from like arthropods and worms, and he goes before the bacteria. He goes way down. He starts with teeth and feathers, I think, doesn't he?
He talks about these two complex features that are found in the fossil record.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what it was.
You find teeth, and you also find feathers or impressions thereof, and he observes that both of these have a wide variety of uses in biology. For example, teeth can be used to scissor, stab, grind, dig, chisel, sieve.
Like a whale, like a baleen whale, like elephants do, tusks,
or inject venom.
Yeah, like a snake, yeah.
And so each of these different designs, which the evolutionist doesn't like to use that word, but it can't help using the word because you can't get away from it.
There used to be an old expression that if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Mm-hmm. If it looks like it's designed in so many ways, it probably was designed. This is the argument from intelligent design, which they reject categorically, but still, it's a strong argument because it's still, you cannot help it, Doug, because what else, it works so well. And in so many instances, like the feather, for instance, how do you get a partial feather? From frayed scales, it's not even the same DNA. It's not even composed of the same kind of stuff.
So we have these rocks that just seem to appear in this particular piece of the head, in your mouth, where it's actually useful.
Oh, we're talking about teeth. Yeah, okay.
You talk about eye teeth. Well, that wouldn't work very well. Or the tooth in your ear. How many times did it get it wrong before it got it right?
Well, the thing what gets you is there's something that it's called anthropomorphism, where you put consciousness to inanimate object, and evolution is forced into this thing. They try to tell you over and over again it's random, just bizarre, but yet it inexorably goes towards complexity. This makes no sense based on any kind of observation that we do have, especially the observation that, number one, life always comes from life, life never comes from non-life. Right. Never things do go from simple to complex. They usually break down and go from complex to simple, or they break down entirely to basically death and decay. You never get anything coming up onto something more complex and more functional, unless you've got something directing it.
Exactly.
It's not enough to have just energy. You have to have energy plus information. We've talked about that many times in our show. You have to have some kind of cognitive purpose for something to happen, because there's so many things in the thing, and I don't know, Jerry, because he goes into that, I can't remember, but the idea that unless everything works, in so many structures, nothing works.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of things that was the whole idea of irreducible complexity. But there's also not only irreducible complexity, Doug, there's specified complexity. It's like if this thing works for this, they can't even conceive of something else that part of this thing would have been used for in another, they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out things that certain features might have been used for before it comes into its fine, like for instance, like a tooth or a feather.
When you see them talking about this in the evolutionist literature, they often capitalize natural selection as if it's some sort of little demonic deity that's
it does. Natural selection is the force that causes complexity out of non-complexity. It just doesn't work that way. Somebody once said, well, when Darwin said survival of the fittest, and somebody else come out, more like survival of the luckiest, But it's not so much even that. It's more about things that work. We talked about, Doug, in the simplest thing. Jerry doesn't get into this, but every time we talk about this, like oxygen, Doug. If we weren't designed to use oxygen, we could never live. I mean, oxygen corrodes everything. It just destroys things. But the feather in the tooth, I illustrated a couple articles on tooth evolution for Jerry and feather evolution, and I go, wow, this is too. I mean, people don't think about it, but the reality is things don't morph into something else. It's not CGI animation, Doug. It basically biology works differently, and it doesn't do what they say it could do, but they can sort of trick you. Because there are adaptations and changes that happen in the living record, but they're not about increased complexity. They're not about things working that never worked before. Right. They're not about that. So
feathers, besides flight, they're used for signaling and courtship and waterproofing, streamlining the body, protective coloration, insulation, and chemical defense. And Jerry didn't talk about this, but I would add to this the problem that flight would have had to evolve at least 4 different times, and in bats, birds, insects, and flying reptiles, and you could also maybe include flying fish as part of it, But when this is what I often say about that, is when a scientist doesn't have an explanation for it, they'll give it a name.
They'll put a name and it makes you sound like
in this particular case, it's convergent evolution.
Yeah.
And therefore, they try to mask the problem. I call it evolutionary fairy dust.
Doug, a dragonfly's wings are entirely different than a bird's wings, which are entirely different, or a bumblebee's wings, which are entirely different from a pterodactyl's wings, which are entirely different from a bat's wings. I mean, they're all different. And they tell you how unbelievably ridiculous the odds were that things could happen once. Mm-hmm. And here they want you to have it 4 distinctly different things. And the wing of a dragonfly it's not even created out of the same DNA structures as the thing for wings for, let's say, a bird, or a flying mammal, So those are the kinds of things that really beg the question: how much faith do you really need to have an evolution? How much religious faith in naturalism do you have to have?
And it's much more reasonable to presume that there's a God who actually took out of his toolbox for each of these different creatures the same kind of design features that he put in for bats, as for flying squirrels, for birds, and for pterodactyls. Because he knows what flight does and knows how to make it work. And
I think, Doug, the thing, we didn't talk about this before, but with that, Doug showed me before the show started some things they're teaching, in the Sudan, right? Where they have it? South Sudan. And it's so out of date. But one of the things that they line in there was, well, since these things are common elements, they must have had a common origin. And as a creationist, we say, no, more like a common designer.
That's right.
And that's what you were really getting at, because it makes more sense. Common origins don't make diversity. They generally break down into simplicity. And that's the thing where people don't understand. There's variety built into the genome, and within that program, you can have all kinds of neat things happen, but there are limits, and we found that out with the biological record, Doug. There are certain limits that things don't go by. In fact, Jerry kind of points that out in the fossil. Is like in the fossil record, is because he goes through all the creatures. He gets to the dinosaurs. He gets to the amphibians and reptiles and birds. But what you really have is you have, rather than evolution, you have stasis. You have things where nothing's really changing. It's within certain limits. You see this. In fact, I used to remember we talked about this years ago when the rock pigeons, and then when they get back to an environment which certain things are normalized, they reverted back to their standard rock pigeon rather than their long bills or whatever the things they had in the Galapagos. I can't remember what it was, but which indicates that there's genomic imprints, if you will, that's put in the program. We've talked about the genetic code, which Jerry doesn't get into that so much. He's talking about fossils primarily, but it's still, you can't avoid that. When you get into the genome, you go, wow, this is a 4-dimensional computer code. Mm-hmm. It's so amazing. So anyway,
let's talk about this natural selection.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk a little bit about that.
And this little demon capriciously goes out and picks what will survive in the next iteration of evolution. And this demon is not to be questioned. It's something that, but apparently in the name of science, we must attribute all origin of life and all everything that to this impersonal force in nature, rather than a creator God.
Right.
And in the scientific world, if we question this, there's consequences to be paid for doubting the scenario. And I find this a problem.
And Jerry's written other books on that. He's called the Criterion and What's the Slaughter of the Dissidents. He's talked about if you don't kowtow to this evolutionary paradigm, if you're in the scientific realm, you will likely get fired or ostracized or pushed aside. This happens all too often.
It almost happens universally.
Yeah, it's really, really bad. It's not, these people that talk about fairness and equanimity and basically even-handedness, they are totally bigots. If you're a creationist in the scientific realm, they're a bigot. They're absolutely bigoted, and they fight you to me so hard because you're challenging their religion. Mm-hmm. This is what really amounts to. We're the ones supposed to be the bigots and the people who are afraid and insecure. Look, go ahead. I'm going to debate with you, and go ahead and debate with me. But why fire me unless you're afraid? To me, people that don't allow you the access to the information, these are people who are fear mongers, and they're all about fear. And that's what I look at, people who are afraid to have ideas come.
Now, let's talk about some of the things that are put in the evolutionary textbooks, like
go ahead.
Like the horse series, like the
defunct,
like the series that they put for the whales. I just find it really interesting the idea that the whale over a period of time went from the ocean back to become a mammal, and then a land mammal coming back into the ocean, and losing its feet and flippers and fins, and having its nose go to the back of its head, and have all these different things happen to it, develop a torpedo-shaped body, and so it can, and the sonar and all these different things.
Yeah, it's like this is natural selection. It makes things happen. It's like a creator, but without the responsibility. And I guess that's the thing that when you really get down to it. Jerry doesn't talk about this, but the reality is it's a philosophical aversion to being responsible or beholden to somebody above yourself.
Right.
And that's really what it's always about that.
And these series that they put together where they show
the linkages?
Yes, you can do the same thing with your silverware to show that forks evolved from spoons.
We did that once years ago. Called the spork is the missing link between a spoon and a fork. And everyone knows that's ridiculous, but because they're all designed for its own particular use and its own particular function. And Doug, is every time they come up with a missing link, they create 3 more missing links.
Right.
You know? So
he has a chapter on invertebrates.
Yep.
And the vertebrates, and then he talks about in this chapter of invertebrates, arthropods and insects. And then he talks about fish, amphibians, dinosaurs, birds, bats, and whales. And what he points out in each of these are the specific features of them, like in bats, the echolocation, and
okay.
And you also have the same thing in dolphins and whales, where you have
convergent evolution again.
That's right, yeah. and so each of these, he shows the fossils of each of these in detail, and how showing that there are millions of examples of each of them, but none of them showing transitions between them. And that's where you get the problems with evolution, is trying to figure out where the transitional forms actually lie.
And
they're speculative.
They never really find transitional forms for the most part. I mean, in fact, he does quote Duane Gish's book, Evolution, the Fossils Say No. Mm-hmm. He does quote that. Duane Gish did a pretty good job in that. And things have not changed, Doug. That argument that Duane Gish put up, his first book was early 70s, and then he revised it in the late 90s, I think.
Yeah, it was called The Challenge of the Fossil
Record.
And so there's just so much evidence that Jerry's brought out here that fossils really don't show what the evolutionists would really like it to like.
Well, Doug, and the thing is, I've always thought about this too. If the evolutionary scenario were correct, why are we able to actually have a system of nomenclature that even makes sense? There should be so many missing things in between that everything just kind of, remember the 1700s had something called the Great Chain of Being.
Yeah.
The whole, I don't know if I'm getting this right, but I always kind of understood it's like there's all these links and missing things that keep going and going. There should be really no way to distinguish between maybe an amphibian and a reptile, because there's everything in between. When does the reptile become an amphibian become the reptile? Or the same thing from the reptile becoming a bird or a mammal. When there should be all these missing links, and there should be more of those than there are actually complete categories. But yet everyone recognizes the category. A mammal is a mammal, and a reptile is a reptile, and a bird is a bird. Arthropods, insects, they all have their classifications. Within certain things, there's all kinds of variety, but they're not changing into something else. We don't see this if any place you'd find it, and Darwin mentioned it very much, that was the weakness of his argument, is that he didn't find it in the fossil record, and they kept appealing to the idea, but it's a fairly new science. Well, over the years we should find them. We still haven't found them. Exactly. Jerry brings that up. We have not found these missing links. Every time they keep trying to propose one as a missing link, as I said, they find 3 other ones that are missing, or they realize, this doesn't fit at all. The vaunted horse series, which we were raised with, they pretty much kicked it out. It doesn't work at all, And even the human evolution series is really, really bad. It's really, instead of all these evolutionary tree, you got very basic evolutionary bushes. Get dead ends.
And the problem with the forensic science is that you have clues from the events that have already taken place in the past. Mm-hmm. And the further you are from the event, the more that the evidence deteriorates. And you only have, even the evolutionary textbook that talked about a fossil has problems with it, in that it can be flattened, it can be crushed, it can be broken into pieces, and it can have a whole bunch of parts of it missing. And
you can't really figure out what the you can feel like some of the musculature sometimes, but you can't figure out the coloration. You can't figure out most of the DNA thing if it's been fossilized. Although that's another story right in and of itself there, because they are actually finding DNA. They never thought to look for it, Doug, because millions of years old they knew DNA couldn't be around, but they're finding DNA and hemoglobin and collagen and dinosaurs. Yeah, it's
and then they're getting they don't think to carbon-14 date these things, but
Creations
when they
are doing
do, creations are doing it, and they're finding out that
Everything's got carbon-14 in it.
and that means that it's young.
It's young, because carbon-14 does not, after about 5,700, what is it, 5714 is its half-life, or 5730. And so after 50,000 years, you should have basically zipped out of nothing, and you're finding things in supposedly 65 million years ago, and they just, and whenever they find that, Doug, they always say, oh, contamination. I said, why is it always contamination? Because it doesn't fit their worldview.
Right.
It has nothing to do whether it's real or not. And then, Doug, when they find carbon-14 in the matrix of coal and of diamonds, that really begs the question, say, how did that happen? They don't like to admit those kinds of things, but they're furiously trying to answer those questions.
Now, the evidence really shows you that you have billions of examples of created distinct kinds
Yep.
of plants and animals that were already perfectly working for what they were designed for.
Yep,
But none of them show a transition.
that's what I was getting at.
And
yeah.
so you don't see half feathers, half wings.
Or half feathers, half scales, or
Right.
whatever. You don't see that. Yep.
Yeah, and so evolutionists are sort of left with a task of providing an adequate explanation why this is the case.
We used to call those just so stories.
Yeah, the thing of it is that these just so stories seem just so good on the surface, but when you get right down to
They
the
fall
bottom
apart,
of it,
yeah.
they fall apart, and it's really hard to justify the logic that's behind them once you expose them. And people really need to take a little class in what fallacies are and what logic
I
is.
know. Yeah, it would be a good.
When you expose what actually is a fallacy, you find affirming the antecedent and chronological snobbery and all these other different things that are used as arguments.
Well, there's a lot of
Break
ad
down
hominem
into-
arguments. They make you say, "Oh, you're pushing religion." I go, even though I am, what I'm saying false?
Right.
And the honest ones say, "Well, no," but it can't be true.
Pick up this book. It's called
Yep.
Fossil Forensics, Separating the Fact from Fantasy in Paleontology by Dr. Jerry Bergman. We'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.
I know.